Some towns are born from the dust, and to the dust they will inevitably return, and in the intervening years they merely sit under the baking sun and watch the wind carve the earth into deep and unyielding lines. And it was in such a town that Alara lived her quiet and unremarkable life. The people of Oakhaven were not cruel by nature, but they were hardened by the relentless seasons and the failing crops and the sheer effort of surviving. And so they found their entertainment where they could, often in the judgment of those who did not fit the precise and narrow molds they had cast for themselves. Alara was, by all conventional standards of the time and the place, thoroughly plain, possessing a face that was more architecture than art, with sharp angles and steady eyes that did not flutter or coyly turn away, but instead held the gaze of the world with a quiet and almost unnerving dignity. She did not wear the bright calicos or the delicate ribbons that the other young women paraded through the dusty streets on Sunday afternoons, and she did not engage in the breathless and giggling speculation about which of the local farm boys might inherit the best acreage, choosing instead to mend the harnesses and tend the small, stubborn garden behind her father's failing blacksmith shop. The town, in its collective and unspoken wisdom, had long ago decided that Alara was destined for spinsterhood, a fate they whispered about with a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction, for it is always comforting to the ordinary to see someone firmly placed at the bottom of the social hierarchy. "You're too plain to catch a husband," they laughed, not always to her face, but loud enough for the wind to carry the words to her ears, and she would simply nod and turn back to the anvil and the heat of the forge, her hands blackened with soot and her heart shielded by a profound and enduring stubbornness. She knew the value of a strong seam and a well-tended fire and the quiet peace of a solitary morning, and she did not need the validation of boys who could not tell a draft horse from a mule. The years passed in a slow and rhythmic procession of planting and harvesting and shivering through the bitter winters, and Alara grew into a woman of immense and quiet capability, her worth entirely invisible to those who measured value only in dimples and dowries. She was the foundation upon which her father's survival rested, yet in the eyes of the town, she was merely a fixture, as permanent and unremarkable as the old hitching post outside the general store, destined to weather and fade and eventually be forgotten entirely. And then came the autumn that brought Silas Thorne, a man whose reputation preceded him like a dark and rolling storm front, carrying whispers of vast herds and endless acres and a fortune built from iron will and calloused hands. He rode into Oakhaven on a horse that looked more like a force of nature than an animal, a massive beast of deep charcoal and restless energy, and the entire town stopped to watch him pass, the blacksmiths lowering their hammers, and the women pausing with their brooms, and the children staring with wide and unblinking eyes. Silas was not a handsome man in the traditional sense, but he possessed a rugged and undeniable presence, a grounding gravity that seemed to pull the very air toward him. His clothes dusted with the long miles of the trail, but his posture as straight and unyielding as a freshly felled pine. He had come to Oakhaven, not for idle chatter or social pleasantries, but for supplies and perhaps a trade. And he moved through the town with a deliberate and sweeping visual pacing, his eyes taking in the failing storefronts and the desperate faces with a calm and observant detachment. He did not smile at the coquettish glances of the mayor's daughters, and he did not engage in the boastful banter of the local men at the saloon, but instead conducted his business with a sparse and subtext-heavy efficiency, his words measured and precise, and devoid of any unnecessary flourish. It was on his third day in town, while negotiating the repair of a broken wagon axle at the blacksmith shop, that he first truly noticed Alara, who was silently working the bellows, her face illuminated by the sudden and fierce bloom of the fire. He watched the way she moved, the rhythmic and powerful thrust of her arms, the total absence of self-consciousness, and the deep, intrinsic competence that radiated from her every action, and in that moment, a quiet and profound recognition sparked within him. He saw past the soot and the plainness in the simple, unadorned dress, and he recognized a kindred spirit, a soul forged in the same relentless crucible of hard work and uncomplaining endurance that had shaped his own life. The town continued to buzz and flutter around him, completely unaware of the silent and monumental shift that had just occurred in the dusty shadows of the forge. But Silas knew, with the certainty of a man who trusts his instincts more than his eyes, that he had found something infinitely more valuable than a fixed axle or a favorable trade. He lingered longer than necessary, his gaze lingering on the steady rhythm of her work, the sparks flying like tiny, dying stars in the dimness of the shop, and a slow-burning tension began to coil between them, a silent and unacknowledged gravity that pulled them together across the divide of wealth and station. The inevitable collision of these two disparate worlds occurred not in the romantic glow of a moonlit evening, but in the harsh and unforgiving glare of the midday sun outside the general store, where the town had gathered for the weekly delivery of mail and meager supplies. Elara had come to purchase a tin of saleratus and a spool of heavy thread, her demeanor as grounded and stoic as ever, when she found herself cornered by a group of the town's most prominent and idle matrons, their tongues sharpened by boredom and their hearts hardened by a lifetime of petty grievances. They began with subtle and thinly veiled barbs, commenting on the fraying hem of her dress and the rough texture of her hands, their voices dripping with a syrupy and false concern that was far more cruel than outright hostility. "It is a shame, Elara," Mrs. Higgins simpered, her voice carrying over the rattle of the approaching stagecoach, "that you spend so much time in that dirty shop, for you will surely never find a man willing to take a bride who smells of coal dust and horse sweat, and you are far too plain to catch a husband on charm alone." The laughter that followed was light and fluttering and entirely merciless, a chorus of mocking agreement that echoed against the wooden facades of the buildings and seemed to hang suspended in the dry and stagnant air. Elara did not flush, and she did not look away, but simply stood her ground with that same quiet dignity, her jaw set and her eyes calm, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a visible wound, for she had long ago armored herself against their shallow judgments. But the laughter grew louder, emboldened by her silence, and the crowd began to press in, a collective and unified force of exclusion, reveling in the public humiliation of the town's most steadfast outcast. They pointed and they whispered and they sneered, their cruelty a desperate attempt to elevate their own meager standings by diminishing hers, and Elara, for all her profound stubbornness, felt a cold and heavy weight settling in her chest, the isolating reality of her existence pressing down upon her with unbearable force. She prepared to turn and walk away, to retreat to the familiar and forgiving heat of the forge, when the crowd suddenly parted, silenced by a shadow that fell across the wooden boardwalk, cold and sudden and heavy with an unmistakable authority. Silas Thorne stepped into the center of the gathering, his boots sounding loud and definitive against the planks, his face a mask of cold and furious stillness that instantly extinguished the smirking laughter of the matrons and sent a ripple of genuine fear through the onlookers. He did not shout, and he did not engage in theatrical displays of anger, but simply looked at the women with a gaze so intensely observant and deeply contemptuous that they shrank back, pulling their shawls tight against the sudden chill of his presence. He moved to Elara's side, his massive frame dwarfing hers, yet he did not crowd her, leaving a respectful and deliberate space between them as he turned his attention to the sputtering and terrified Mrs. Higgins. "You mistake vanity for value, ma'am," he said, his voice low and rhythmic and carrying the dangerous rumble of distant thunder. "And you have no understanding of the difference between a decoration and a foundation." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of heavy and breathless stillness that precedes a cataclysm. And then Silas turned to Elara, his eyes softening a fraction, the subtext heavy and thick in the space between them. He did not ask permission, and he did not offer a grand and romantic declaration, but instead delivered a line that was quiet, devastating, and entirely definitive, a statement of fact rather than a proposal. "She's coming with me," he said, the words falling like stones into a still pond, and the shock that washed over the town was palpable, a collective gasp of disbelief that this wealthy, powerful rancher would choose the plain and silent blacksmith's daughter over every other woman in Oakhaven. Elara looked up at him, her steady eyes searching his face for mockery or pity, but finding only a profound and unwavering respect, a silent challenge that demanded she match his courage with her own. And in that moment, a silent and irrevocable agreement was forged, not with words, but with a shared and unspoken understanding of endurance and capability. And Elara, with a slow and deliberate nod, handed her spool of thread to the nearest stunned onlooker and walked away from the only life she had ever known, stepping out of the dust and into the vast, unknown territory of Silas Thorne's world. The journey to the ranch was long and arduous, a days-long trek across a landscape that grew increasingly wild and untamed, the rolling plains giving way to jagged foothills and deep, echoing canyons where the wind howled with an ancient and mournful voice. They rode in a companionable silence, the vastness of the environment juxtaposed against the intimate, human reality of their shared proximity. And Elara found herself observing the way Silas moved, the effortless and deeply ingrained competence with which he handled the horses, the campfires, and the endless miles of rough terrain. He did not treat her as a delicate burden, nor did he offer unnecessary assistance, but instead allowed her to prove her own capability, watching with quiet approval as she seamlessly integrated into the rhythm of the trail, gathering wood and tending the coffee and reading the weather with the same pragmatic skill she had applied to her father's forge. When they finally crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley that held the Thorne Ranch, Elara felt a sudden and breathtaking expansion in her chest, for the property was vast beyond comprehension, a sprawling empire of grass and timber and water that stretched to the distant, snow-capped peaks. The house itself was a sprawling, sturdy structure of stone and heavy timber, built to withstand the punishing elements rather than to impress a passing eye. And as they rode down into the valley, Elara felt the weight of the town's judgments falling away, replaced by the heavy, grounding reality of this new and immense world. They arrived in the gathering dusk, the air crisp and biting, and Silas showed her to a large and sparsely furnished room, the silence between them thick but no longer tense, replaced instead by a slow-building and comfortable mutual respect. She assessed the room with a practical and unromantic eye, noting the quality of the wool blankets and the solid construction of the bed frame, and she knew, with a quiet and resolute certainty, that she could build a life in this sprawling, lonely place. The first weeks were a slow settling in, a careful and deliberate dance of learning the routines of the ranch and the silent rhythms of the man who ran it. And Elara threw herself into the work with a ferocious and unyielding dedication, determined to prove that she was not merely a charity case, but a partner of true and equal value. The life they built was constructed not of grand gestures or breathless romance, but of 1,000 quiet and essential actions, a daily repetition of chores and responsibilities that formed the iron-strong foundation of their shared existence. They rose before the sun, the cold air biting at their lungs, and worked side by side in the dim light of the barns, the breath of the horses pluming in the freezing air, their movements synchronized in a silent and heavily choreographed routine that required no words. She learned the ledgers and the complex logistics of the massive operation, her sharp mind organizing the chaos of supply lines and grain yields, while he pushed the herds across the distant pastures, their days separate but their purpose entirely unified. Before we continue along this rugged trail, let me pause and ask, where in the world are you listening from today as we journey together through this dusty and wind-swept terrain? Drop your location in the comments, for it is always a profound comfort to know how far these stories travel across the miles. Returning to the ranch, the banter between Silas and Elara, when it did occur, was polite but pointed, a dry and situational humor that relied heavily on irony and unspoken agreements, the stubborn repetition of minor daily disagreements over the amount of salt in the stew, or the proper way to coil a lariat, becoming an endearing and essential part of their language. Arguments were never framed as hostility, but rather as a form of intellectual intimacy, a testing of each other's boundaries and a mutual demand for excellence. And Silas would often just shake his head, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, acknowledging her absolute and unbending will. They communicated their growing affection through practical support, a mended coat left quietly on a chair, a hot cup of coffee waiting after a brutal ride in the rain, a heavy hand resting briefly on a shoulder. These actions speaking louder and carrying far more weight than 1,000 hollow poems. Elara earned the respect of the ranch hands, not by demanding it, but by her relentless competence, Her willingness to plunge her hands into the freezing mud and her refusal to flinch from the bloody, necessary work of survival. And slowly, the vast and lonely ranch began to feel like something entirely new. It began to feel like a home. As the months bled into years, a deliberate and rhythmic pacing settled over their lives, the passage of seasons marking the slow burn deepening of their bond, rewarding their patience with a quiet and emotionally resonant intimacy. Winter came down from the mountains like a hunting wolf, burying the valley in deep, blue-shadowed drifts and sealing them inside the stone house, where the massive hearth became the center of their world, its flames casting dancing shadows against the heavy timber walls. They spent the long, dark evenings in a shared and profound silence, Silas meticulously repairing tack while Elara worked her needle through heavy canvas, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind and the occasional, deeply comfortable sigh of a sleeping hound. This was the landscape-based metaphor of their lives, harsh and unforgiving on the outside, but holding a deep, warm, and fiercely protected core, a sanctuary built from mutual reliance and an unshakable, silent trust. Callbacks to their initial meeting became recurring motifs. He would occasionally hand her a spool of thread with a perfectly straight face, and she would raise a single eyebrow in return, a silent acknowledgement of the dusty town they had left behind and the monumental distance they had traveled together. He watched her constantly, not with the hungry, consuming gaze of a young lover, but with the steady, observant appreciation of a man who knows he possesses something of immeasurable and irreplaceable worth, noting the silver that began to thread through her dark hair and the deepening lines around her eyes, finding every new mark to be a testament to her strength. Her plainness, which had been a source of such bitter mockery in Oak Haven, was to Silas the very essence of her beauty, for it was unadorned and real and deeply, fundamentally true, a face that could weather any storm and never lose its quiet, striking dignity. Theirs was a romantic drama stripped of all theatrics, a connection forged in the crucible of shared labor and profound, unyielding respect, a love that grew not like a fragile flower, but like the deep and twisting roots of an ancient oak, gripping the rocky soil and refusing to be moved. The ultimate test of this rooted strength came during the brutal winter of '88, a season of such unprecedented fury that it is still spoken of in hushed and reverent tones by the old-timers who remember the way the sky turned the color of bruised iron. A blizzard struck with terrifying speed, catching a massive portion of the herd in the exposed lower valley, the snow falling so fast and so thick that it blinded the eyes and choked the lungs, threatening to wipe out years of grueling labor and sacrifice in a single, devastating night. Silas stood by the window, his face grim and his jaw locked, knowing that to ride out into that white void was tantamount to suicide, but knowing equally well that to stay by the fire meant the ruin of everything he had built. Elara did not wait for him to ask, and she did not try to stop him. Instead, she simply pulled on her heaviest wool coat, wrapped a scarf tightly around her face, and walked out the door toward the stables, her actions speaking volumes more than any frantic argument could have conveyed. They rode out together into the howling madness, the cold slicing through their layers like sharpened steel, the wind shrieking with a deafening roar, and they fought side by side, pushing the panicked and freezing cattle toward the shelter of the timberline, their bodies pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. For hours they battled the storm, communicating only through desperate shouts and the raw, physical exertion of their wills, dragging calves from the drifts and forcing the stubborn animals forward, a brutal and chaotic ballet against the lethal forces of nature. When they finally returned to the stone house, hours past midnight, they were half frozen, bruised, and utterly exhausted, collapsing onto the floor before the hearth, their breathing ragged and their clothes stiff with ice. But as Silas looked over at Elara, her face pale and her hands trembling, he saw not defeat, but a fierce and triumphant light in her eyes. And the culmination of their silent partnership was realized in that freezing room, the absolute certainty that there was no force on earth, natural or man-made, that they could not face and conquer together. When spring finally broke the iron grip of that terrible winter, it brought with it a profound and quiet transformation, the melting snow revealing a world washed clean and a bond between them that had been forged into something entirely indestructible. The tension that had hovered in the background for years, the unspoken weight of their arrangement, dissolved completely, replaced by an immovable and deep-seated love that required no grand declarations but demanded only truth. They were standing on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and burning gold, the air smelling of wet earth and new growth, when Silas finally broke the long, comfortable silence. "They called you plain, back in that dusty patch of nothing," he said, his voice carrying the rhythmic, lyrical cadence of a man speaking from the very bottom of his soul, a voice heavy with earnest nostalgia and quiet drama. Elora looked at him, the fading light catching the strong, unapologetic architecture of her face, and she offered a small, dry smile, relying on the situational humor that had sustained her for so long. "And you agreed with them, as I recall, only you preferred the term foundation." Silas turned to fully face her, his massive hands reaching out to gently cup her face, his touch startlingly tender for a man of such rough and calloused edges. "You are the foundation," he whispered, the polysyndeton of his thoughts spilling over into his words. "And you are the storm, and you are the fire in the hearth, and you are the only truly beautiful thing I have ever known." It was a short, punchy, definitive emotional statement that contrasted sharply with the flowing, endless landscape around them, and Elora, who had never wept from cruelty or hardship, felt the sudden, hot prick of tears, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming and triumphant relief of being truly, entirely seen. They stood together as the stars blinked into existence over the sprawling ranch, the open loop of their future finally closed, the quiet climax of their story etched into the very soil of the valley, a testament to the enduring power of steady companionship and unyielding faith. Decades later, the town of Oakhaven had mostly crumbled back into the dust from which it came, its petty judgments and shallow hierarchies swallowed by time, and the relentless march of progress, the names of those who had laughed outside the general store forgotten by history. But the Thorn Ranch expanded and thrived, a legendary empire of the West, and at its heart remained Silas and Elora, their hair now white as the winter snow, their bodies bent by the years, but their quiet dignity and profound stubbornness entirely undiminished. They walked the property together every evening, a slow and deliberate progression through the fields they had saved and the life they had built, their silence still heavy with subtext, their shared history a vast and beautiful landscape of memory and sacrifice. They proved that worth is not measured by the superficial flutter of youth or the cruel assessments of small minds, but by the steady, uncomplaining work of building something real, and that a love rooted in mutual respect and earned trust will outlast the most fiery and performative passions. We often look for love in the brightest lights and the loudest voices, forgetting that the strongest foundations are usually laid in the quiet dark, forged in the fires of shared hardship and cemented by the simple, daily choice to stand by someone's side when the winds blow cold. So look to the steady hands, look to the quiet endurance, and remember that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the world laughing and end with the world watching in silent, awestruck reverence. Thank you for walking this long and winding trail with me today, for sharing in the quiet triumphs and the slow-burning fires of those who endure. Until our paths cross again, keep your gaze steady, keep your foundations strong, and may you always find the beauty in the quiet, unspoken corners of the world.